Hello and welcome to the Avenue Uniting Church in Blackburn, Victoria, meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples. My name is Rod Peppiatt. Today, a reflection draws on a gospel story from Mark chapter 10, a story of Jesus and a man who was blind, I should say. From Mark chapter 10. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and he said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So, throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and went to Jesus. Then Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." And immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. I am, in colloquial terms, blind as a bat. Without modern specs technology, I would look at the world through lenses that looked like the bottom of Coke bottles. And that's been my story since I was 10 years old. Since then, my vision has been framed by my lenses, and I'm deeply grateful that I live in a time when that's possible. In later years, I've made a number of discoveries about my glasses. That multifocals are no good for reading in bed, but pretty good for most other things. That I can buy reading glasses for about $40 or $50. And that if I look over the top of my glasses to read, I can drive my wife nuts. So I don't. Not often anyway. For me, it's not only a vision thing. I have some very clear memories of panic attacks when I was separated from my glasses. It's a disempowering thing for me, and I become very vulnerable. In Mark's Gospel, Bartimaeus woke up completely blind every day and was a beggar. He sat by the roadside, existing on the charity of passers-by. Let's remember here that his people were obliged by their faith to support and give charity, but it wasn't a good or secure living by any means. I might feel vulnerable without my glasses. Bartimaeus was vulnerable. His fortunes and well-being were almost completely out of his hands. And his place within society was determined for him too. He was to sit and be thankful for the money and the food he received. And he was presumably not to create too much of a nuisance while he was about it. So what do we know about Bartimaeus? Apart from his first name, the adjective, blind. Well, we know that Bartimaeus means son of Timaeus in Aramaic, and that's about it. We also know that he heard that Jesus was near, and he began to call out loudly for his attention. The people around him told him to shut up. It wasn't his place, they said, to be the centre of attention. And why would the visiting rabbi be interested in him anyway? Clearly, he was a sinner. If he wasn't, he wouldn't be blind. That's how things worked. That's how they understood. I've talked before about the value of approaching biblical texts and stories through the context in which they appear. And I shouldn't say value, I should say imperative. Context is everything. And this often gives us a purpose and an insight, rather, into the narrative purpose of the story, of why it's told, of where it is, why it is there in that particular part of a gospel story. And it's important because no story just appears in the gospel for the sake of it. The writers have collected and arranged and carefully crafted their gospels to make a particular point or a set of points. Each of those gospels is a statement of faith in its own right. Each reflects what the writers and storytellers want their audience, way back when they were written and collected, what they wanted them to know about Jesus and how to respond. And so looking at this particular story in Mark and what's going on around it offers some useful clues to the writer's narrative purpose. Now that's true whether we understand the stories literally or symbolically or metaphorically true. You see, this isn't the only story told in Mark's Gospel of Jesus healing a blind person. The other one, remember that this is in chapter 10, the other one recurs in chapter 8 in Bethsaida. It's the one where Jesus spits on a man's eyes and he slowly gains his sight. After all, initially the people looked like trees. So there's that couple of chapters. And in the middle of those couple of chapters, or those two stories, we see that some of Mark's most important stories occur. Stories that generally seem to be about people not seeing, not understanding what Jesus is all about. In some cases, his disciples, and in other cases, civic and religious leaders. And let me sort of list them for you for a moment. We have Peter calling Jesus the Messiah without a real sense of what that means. And then we have the story of the transfiguration of Jesus and teachings on prayer and stories where it says, the Son of Man will be killed and all of those kinds of things. We have stories about a conversation about who is for them, who's on their side, who's against them. We have James and John's big request to sit on Jesus' right and left side in glory, to have honoured places. Also on the way we see Jesus attacking the legalism and the inhumanity of the divorce laws of his day, or how they were applied. And we see his encounter with the rich young man who couldn't follow. But there in Bethsaida in chapter 8, and here at Jericho in chapter 10, we see two blind men regaining their sight. It's no accident. Mark calls his readers to new vision in many senses of that word. Bartimaeus, like the unnamed man in Bethsaida, are symbols of the need to see what's going on. And for Mark, that means noticing what's going on in Jesus and with Jesus, and taking up the call to follow. And that becomes very important very quickly in the flow of Mark's Gospel after this story, because Jesus, at that point, his next steps are towards Jerusalem and Calvary. So, back to Bartimaeus. We've zoomed out a bit, now let's zoom back in. The text tells us that Bartimaeus began to cry out once he hears that the one the crowd is following is Jesus of Nazareth. Presumably he's heard of him. And not only that, what he'd heard suggested that Jesus might be able to do something for him. So he begins, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." As we saw earlier, the people around him tell him to be quiet. Why would Jesus be interested in him? But then the unthinkable happens. Jesus is interested in him and calls him. Bartimaeus' persistence pays off. And this must be an important part of Mark's story, I'm sure. Because in his insistence, we see some important things. We see the courage to take responsibility for himself and his need. We see the words he calls out, "Jesus, Son of David." It's a statement of faith. Linking him with the royal house, linking Jesus with the royal house of David. In a sense, naming him as the fulfillment of all of those centuries of prophecy. He's named where others fail to see. Jesus is named by a blind man who wouldn't shut up. And then Jesus responds to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Silly question of the week. Jesus, he's blind. Take a guess. It seems a strange question, doesn't it? But it isn't. Not for Bartimaeus or for the bigger picture of Mark's Gospel. Here, Bartimaeus is given the opportunity to speak for himself. Perhaps being blind isn't the biggest issue he faces. Jesus doesn't assume. After all, being blind and dependent on others for your living isn't much of a living, but it's something that could be at risk. But even more deeply, Jesus gives Bartimaeus a dignity and a humanity that others don't. He can name for himself what he needs and wants. "Master, let me see again." And Jesus says to him, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." And in Mark's big picture, the one who gets it, the one who sees what Jesus is about, is the one with the courage to recognise his own need, to keep calling and to risk a relationship with Jesus. What everyone else misses, the blind man sees and responds. As I finish, hear again the last verse of this story as Mark tells it. Immediately he regained his sight and followed Jesus on the way. We don't know anything of Bartimaeus after this story, where his new sight led him. It's kind of a pity that Mark doesn't have a follow-up story, a sort of where are they now kind of thing. But we can be sure that it was different from where he was in life before he met Jesus. Seeing. How does it change us? What do we do about what we can see? As I pay attention to the story of Bartimaeus and Jesus, I find myself wondering again about my blindnesses, about the things in my life for which I cry out, or should, about the courage needed to really see and to act. I know what Bartimaeus saw in Jesus. I wonder what Jesus saw in Bartimaeus. Maybe he saw in him a kindred spirit. After all, Jesus saw lots, and he didn't shut up either. Amen. Blessings.